bound by two hearts. Lady Cecily of Ravensshire had spent years avoiding Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's most feared enforcer. But when he caught her alone in the corridors of the castle, his fingers brushing against her wrist, she knew she had run out of time. "You have secrets, Cecily," he murmured. "The only question is, will you give them to me willingly?" Chapter 1. The Falcon's Shadow. The wind whipped at Cecily's cloak as she stood on the battlements of Ravensshire, the grey stone cold and unforgiving beneath her gloved hands. Below, the courtyard bustled with the usual morning activities: stable boys grooming warhorses, the blacksmith's hammer ringing a steady rhythm against steel, and the kitchen staff preparing the midday meal. Yet, above it all, a hawk circled, its keen eyes scanning the landscape. It was the king's hawk, a constant, unsettling reminder of the royal presence that loomed over Ravensshire and over her. Cecily traced the worn embroidery of her house crest on her sleeve, a raven in flight against a field of silver. Ravensshire, once a proud and independent holding, now felt like a gilded cage. Her brother, Edmund, the current lord of Ravensshire, had sworn fealty to King Alaric, but the cost of that loyalty had been steep. The king demanded not only taxes and soldiers, but also information. And Edmund, ever eager to please his liege, had offered up his sister's unique gift. Cecily could read the whispers. Not the spoken word, but the echoes of thoughts, the residue of intentions left clinging to objects and places. A touch of a tapestry could reveal the weaver's worries, the handle of a sword could scream of its wielder's bloodlust, and a room could hold the secrets of 1,000 whispered conspiracies. It was a gift and a curse, one she had learned to hide, to fear. But Edmund had seen its value. He had presented her to the king as a living relic, a reader of secrets, a tool. She shivered, drawing her cloak tighter. The hawk's shadow passed over her, a fleeting darkness that mirrored the dread in her heart. Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's enforcer, the man they called the king's relentless blade, was coming. Edmund had sent word, his message brimming with barely concealed excitement. Warwick was coming to Ravensshire to assess her abilities, to ensure her loyalty. Or, more likely, to ensure her usefulness. Cecily had spent the last 5 years, since her disastrous almost marriage to Lord Beaumont, carefully constructing a wall around herself. A wall of quiet obedience, of demure smiles, of carefully veiled thoughts. She had learned to control her gift, to filter the overwhelming tide of whispers that threatened to drown her. She had become a ghost in her own home, flitting through the corridors, attending to her duties, and avoiding any attention, especially the kind that came with a royal seal. But Warwick was different. She had seen him, once, at court. He had stood beside the king, a figure of stark, unyielding power. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, had swept over the assembled nobles, missing nothing. Cecily had felt that gaze like a physical blow, a chilling premonition of the danger he represented. He had a reputation for unwavering loyalty, for ruthless efficiency, and for an uncanny ability to uncover even the most deeply buried secrets. She closed her eyes, breathing in the crisp, autumn air. The scent of wood smoke from the village mingled with the earthy aroma of the surrounding forest. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember a time before the fear, before the king's shadow had fallen upon Ravensshire. A time when she had roamed these hills freely, her laughter echoing through the trees. A time before her gift had become a burden. A clatter of hooves on the cobblestones below drew her attention. A small contingent of riders was approaching the castle gates. At their head, a man rode a magnificent black warhorse, his armor gleaming even under the overcast sky. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture radiating an aura of command. Even from this distance, Cecily could feel the intensity of his presence. Sir Nicholas Warwick had arrived. She straightened, her spine stiffening with a resolve born of desperation. She would not cower. She would not break. She had survived this long, navigating the treacherous currents of courtly life, protecting the secrets she held within. She would face Warwick, and she would protect herself, her family, and the fragile peace she had carved out within these walls. But as he dismounted, his gaze locking onto hers across the distance, a shiver of unease ran down her spine. The hawk above gave a shrill cry, and Cecily knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The game had begun, and she was not sure she knew all the rules. The only question remaining was the next move, and how far would she need to go to not lose the game and herself in the process. She only knew she had to survive. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Stone. The great hall of Raven's Hire was a symphony of controlled chaos. Servants hurried to and fro, laying out platters of roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and flagons of ale. The air was thick with the mingled scents of spices, wood smoke, and the faint, lingering aroma of beeswax candles. Lord Edmund, resplendent in his finest velvet doublet, paced anxiously near the high table, his eyes constantly darting towards the entrance. Cecily sat quietly in her usual place, slightly removed from the center of activity. She wore a gown of deep blue, the color of a twilight sky, its simple lines belying the intricate embroidery that adorned the sleeves and hem. Her hair, the color of raven's wings, was braided and pinned up, revealing the delicate curve of her neck. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the worn tabletop, trying to appear calm, composed, and utterly unremarkable. But beneath the surface, her senses were on high alert. The hall itself was a cacophony of whispers. The stones of the ancient walls resonated with the echoes of countless past events, feasts, celebrations, arguments, and betrayals. The tapestries that hung along the walls whispered of the hands that had woven them, of the hopes and fears they had poured into their intricate designs. Even the silverware on the table hummed with the energy of those who had used it. She focused her attention, filtering the overwhelming tide of information, searching for any hint of danger, any clue about Warwick's intentions. It was like sifting through grains of sand, trying to find a single, specific jewel. The effort was exhausting, but it was a necessary precaution. She had learned, through bitter experience, that knowledge was power, and ignorance could be deadly. The arrival of Sir Nicholas Warwick was heralded by a sudden hush that fell over the hall. All eyes turned towards the entrance as he strode in, his presence filling the vast space. He was even more imposing up close. His armor, though travel-stained, was impeccably maintained, reflecting the flickering torchlight. His face was hard, sculpted by years of experience and hardship. His eyes, as she had remembered, were the color of a winter storm, sharp and piercing. He moved with a grace that belied his size, a predator's grace, honed by years of training and battle. Edmund rushed forward, his greeting effusive and bordering on obsequious. "Sir Nicholas, welcome to Raven's Hire. It is a great honor to have you as our guest." Warwick inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Lord Edmund, thank you for your hospitality." His voice was deep, resonant, and carried a hint of steel. Cecily watched him carefully, trying to read the subtle nuances of his body language, the flicker of his eyes, the set of his jaw. He was a master of control, his emotions carefully guarded. But even he could not completely mask the whispers that clung to him. The hilt of his sword, a magnificent weapon of blackened steel, screamed of violence, of battles fought and lives taken. His armor whispered of long rides, of sleepless nights, of the constant weight of responsibility. And beneath it all, something else, a flicker of weariness, perhaps, or a hint of sadness. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but Cecily caught it. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the relentless facade. Edmund led Warwick to the high table, seating him in the place of honor. Cecily found herself seated directly across from him, their eyes meeting for a brief, intense moment. She felt a jolt of something run through her. It was not fear, not exactly, but a strange mixture of apprehension and curiosity. He studied her with an unnerving intensity, his gaze lingering on her face, her hands, her throat exposed by her dress. It felt as if he were stripping away her carefully constructed defenses, layer by layer, searching for the truth beneath. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold it, to project an image of calm indifference. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "Your brother tells me you have a unique gift." She inclined her head slightly, her voice steady. "I am observant, Sir Nicholas." A faint smile touched his lips, but it did not reach his eyes. Observant. An interesting choice of words. The meal progressed, a slow, agonizing dance of polite conversation and veiled scrutiny. Edmund chattered incessantly, boasting of Ravenshire's prosperity and his loyalty to the king. Warwick listened patiently, offering only the occasional noncommittal response. Cecily remained mostly silent, observing, listening, and trying to decipher the unspoken currents that flowed beneath the surface. As the evening wore on, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. Warwick's attention kept returning to her, his gaze lingering, questioning. She could feel him probing, testing, trying to find a weakness, a vulnerability. And she knew, with a growing certainty, that he would not be easily fooled. After the meal, Edmund suggested a tour of the castle. "Sir Nicholas, I would be honored to show you Ravensshire. We have a fine library, a well-stocked armory, and, of course, our gardens are quite renowned." Warwick nodded. "I would be pleased to see them." As they walked through the dimly lit corridors, Cecily found herself trailing slightly behind, separated from the others. The whispers of the castle grew louder, more insistent. The stones seemed to press in on her, the shadows deepening, hiding secrets and dangers. She rounded a corner and found herself face to face with Warwick. He had stopped, waiting for her, his body blocking the narrow passage. The torchlight flickered, casting his face in sharp relief, highlighting the intensity of his gaze. "You have secrets, Cecily," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. His fingers brushed against her wrist, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through her. "The only question is, will you give them to me willingly?" The touch of cold stone sent spikes of fear through her, and she could almost hear the echoes of past secrets whispered from the walls. He was too close, his presence overwhelming, his words a threat veiled in a question. The corridors seemed to tilt. Chapter 3. A Night's Scrutiny. Cecily recoiled instinctively, pulling her wrist away from his touch as if burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The whispers of the castle walls seemed to amplify, swirling around her like a suffocating fog, filled with warnings and half-formed threats. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though her insides trembled. "I have nothing to hide, Sir Nicholas," she said, striving for a tone of calm defiance, though a tremor betrayed her. Her voice echoed strangely in the narrow corridor. His eyes narrowed, the storm within them intensifying. He did not believe her, that much was clear. "Every stone in this castle whispers of secrets, Lady Cecily. And you are a conductor of those whispers, are you not?" He knew. Somehow he knew the truth, or at least a part of it. Her carefully constructed facade of normalcy, of quiet obedience, was crumbling under his relentless scrutiny. She had to regain control, to divert his attention, to protect herself. "My brother speaks highly of my intuition," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I am sensitive to the atmosphere of a place, to the mood of its people." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. The scent of leather and steel, of the cold night air that clung to his cloak, filled her senses. Intuition? Or something more? He reached out, his fingers brushing against a loose strand of her hair that had escaped her braid. The contact was feather-light, yet it felt like a brand. She flinched, but held her ground. "I do not know what you mean, Sir Nicholas." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Then, a flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or a hint of respect crossed his face. "You are a skilled liar, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But I am a skilled reader of lies." He turned, gesturing for her to follow him.
"Come."
"Your brother awaits us. We wouldn't want to keep him waiting." Cecily followed him, her mind racing. She had underestimated him. He was not merely a blunt instrument of the king's will. He was intelligent, perceptive, and dangerously intuitive. He was a hunter, and she was his prey. They rejoined Edmund in the library, a vast, high-ceilinged room lined with shelves filled with ancient tomes and scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a comforting aroma that usually soothed Cecily. But tonight, even the familiar sanctuary of the library felt oppressive, filled with unseen eyes and unheard whispers. Edmund, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, launched into a detailed description of his most prized possessions, a first edition of a Chronicle of Ancient Kings, a beautifully illuminated manuscript of religious texts, a collection of maps charting long-lost territories. Warwick listened politely, his expression inscrutable. He examined the books with a practiced eye, his fingers tracing the delicate script, the intricate illustrations. He seemed genuinely interested, but Cecily could sense that his mind was elsewhere. He was still watching her, still probing, still searching. As Edmund droned on, Cecily's gaze drifted towards a particular section of the library, a shadowed alcove where a collection of older, more fragile scrolls were kept. She felt a sudden, sharp pull, a whisper of something dark hidden. She hesitated, unsure whether to investigate. It could be a trap, a test. Warwick was watching her every move, waiting for her to reveal her true nature. But the pull was too strong to ignore. It felt like a thread, tugging at her, drawing her closer. She excused herself, murmuring something about needing a closer look at a particular scroll. Edmund, engrossed in his monologue, barely noticed her departure. She moved towards the alcove, her heart pounding. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices murmuring secrets she could not quite decipher. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the brittle parchment of a scroll. A jolt of energy surged through her, a wave of images and emotions flooding her senses. She saw a flash of a hidden chamber, a clandestine meeting, a whispered betrayal. She felt a surge of fear, of desperation, of guilt. "Find anything interesting, Lady Cecily?" Warwick's voice, close behind her, made her jump. She whirled around, her hand flying to her chest. He stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on her. She struggled to regain her composure, to mask the shock and the lingering echoes of the vision she had just experienced. "Just an old family history," she stammered. "Nothing of importance." He raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Family history? Or something more relevant?" He reached out, his fingers brushing against the scroll she had just touched. Cecily felt a surge of panic. If he touched it, he would know. He would hear the whispers, see the vision, uncover the secret. Before she could stop him or come up with a convincing lie, he held the scroll, and she knew she was cornered. The silence of the library felt deafening, her own breath sounded too loud in her ear. This was the moment it would all come crashing down. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. Warwick held the scroll, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on the brittle parchment. Cecily held her breath, her mind a whirlwind of desperate calculations. The whispers of the scroll were clamoring in her mind, a jumbled mess of images and emotions, threatening to spill out and reveal everything. She closed her eyes for a fleeting second, focusing all her will on suppressing the flow, on building a wall between her mind and his. He turned the scroll slowly, examining the faded script, the crumbling edges. Cecily could feel his scrutiny, his intense focus, as if he were trying to pierce through the layers of time and secrets to reach the truth hidden within. He was so close, so dangerously close to uncovering everything. "This is older than I expected," he said, his voice a low murmur that broke the tense silence. He didn't sound surprised or alarmed or accusatory. He sounded curious. Cecily opened her eyes, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "It is," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. Many of Ravenshire's records were lost during the previous unpleasantness. She deliberately avoided using the word war, hoping to deflect any further questioning about that particular period of her family's history. He continued to study the scroll, his brow furrowed in concentration. The script is unusual, almost archaic. He looked up at her, his eyes piercing. "Can you read it?" It was a test, she knew. A test of her honesty, of her abilities, of her loyalty. She could lie, pretend she couldn't decipher the ancient script. But something in his gaze, a flicker of something, made her hesitate. Perhaps, just perhaps, a calculated risk was better than outright deception. "Some of it," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "It is difficult. The language is obscure." He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her. "And what does it say?" She hesitated again. The whispers of the scroll were still swirling in her mind, but she had managed to gain some control, to filter the information, to focus on the less incriminating details. "It speaks of a pact," she said, choosing her words carefully. "An agreement between Ravenhire and another house. A long time ago." "Which house?" He pressed, his voice unwavering. She took a deep breath. This was the dangerous part. She had to reveal something, but not everything. "The Blackwood family," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. The Blackwoods had been rivals of Ravenhire for generations, their feud a bloody and bitter one. Mentioning them was a risk, but it was a calculated one. It was a truth, but not the truth. Warwick's eyes narrowed. "The Blackwoods? I thought they were extinct." "Their main line, yes," Cecily said. "But there were rumors. Of survivors. Of hidden branches." He turned his attention back to the scroll, his fingers tracing the faded ink. "And this pact, what was its purpose?" She swallowed hard. "It was a marriage alliance," she said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. It wasn't entirely a lie. There had been marriage alliances between Ravenhire and Blackwood in the distant past, but this scroll spoke of something far more significant, far more dangerous. He looked up at her again, his gaze searching. "A marriage alliance? To what end?" To secure peace," she said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. To end the feud." He studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching, thick with unspoken questions. Then he slowly rolled up the scroll, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Interesting," he said, his voice giving nothing away. "A very enlightening piece of family history." He handed the scroll back to her, their fingers brushing. Cecily felt a jolt of something run through her. Relief? Fear? Or something else entirely? "Perhaps you should keep it safe," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Such valuable documents should be protected." He turned and walked back towards the main part of the library, leaving Cecily alone in the alcove. She stood there, her heart still pounding, her mind racing. She had survived this encounter, but she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. She had given him a piece of the truth, but not all of it. She had bought herself some time, but at what cost? The whispers of the scroll were still echoing in her mind, a constant reminder of the secret she was guarding, of the danger she was facing. She knew that Warwick would not forget this conversation. He would continue to probe, to investigate, to search for the truth. And she knew that she would have to be even more careful, even more vigilant, if she wanted to protect herself and the secrets she held within. He was going to watch her every move now, so she had to be perfect, invisible. As she walked back out of the alcove, she realized that she had made a powerful enemy, or perhaps something a lot more complicated. Chapter 5. Beneath the Royal Gaze. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Sir Nicholas Warwick remained at Ravenhire, his presence a constant, unsettling weight on Cecily's shoulders. He was ostensibly there to assess the castle's defenses, to review the troops, and to discuss matters of state with Edmund. But Cecily knew that his true purpose was to observe her, to test her, to uncover the truth about her abilities. He was a meticulous observer, his eyes missing nothing. He watched her during meals, during walks in the garden, during the evening gatherings in the Great Hall. He engaged her in conversation, asking seemingly innocuous questions about her life, her interests, her opinions. He was probing, always probing, searching for a crack in her carefully constructed facade. Cecily, in turn, maintained a mask of polite indifference. She answered his questions carefully, choosing her words with precision, revealing nothing of her true thoughts or feelings. She spent hours in the chapel, praying for guidance, for strength, for the ability to withstand scrutiny. The cool, quiet sanctuary of the chapel offered a temporary respite from the constant pressure, a place where she could gather her thoughts and reinforce her defenses. The whispers of the castle continued to swirl around her, a constant source of both information and anxiety. She learned to filter them, to focus on the most relevant details, to ignore the background noise. She learned that Warwick had a reputation for unwavering loyalty to the king, for ruthless efficiency, and for an uncanny ability to uncover even the most deeply buried secrets. She also learned that he was a man haunted by his past, by the losses he had suffered, by the burdens he carried. One afternoon, Cecily found herself alone in the castle gardens. The autumn air was crisp and cool, the leaves on the trees turning shades of gold and crimson. She walked along the winding paths, her fingers trailing along the rough stone walls, seeking a moment of peace, a connection to something real and tangible. She heard footsteps behind her, and her heart quickened. She turned to see Warwick approaching, his expression unreadable. "Lady Cecily," he said, his voice a low murmur that blended with the rustling of the leaves. "Enjoying the solitude?" "The gardens are peaceful," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. He stopped beside her, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. "Ravensshire is impressive. A strong fortress, a beautiful estate. It has been in my family for generations," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "And you are loyal to your family?" he asked, his eyes turning to her. It was a loaded question, a test of her allegiances. "Of course," she replied, her voice unwavering. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "Loyalty is a valuable virtue, but it can also be a dangerous one." She met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I am loyal to my family and to my king." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or respect crossed his face. "A careful answer, Lady Cecily. But are those loyalties compatible?" She hesitated. It was a trap, she knew. Any answer she gave could be used against her. They must be," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her. "Indeed, they must be, for the good of the realm." He turned, gesturing towards a small stone bench nestled beneath a weeping willow tree. "Shall we sit?" Cecily hesitated, then nodded. She sat down on the bench, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Warwick sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint scent of leather and steel that clung to him. "Tell me, Lady Cecily," he said, his voice softening slightly. "What do you dream of?" It was an unexpected question, one that caught her off guard. She had not allowed herself to dream in a long time. Dreams were dangerous, foolish things. They led to disappointment, to heartbreak, to vulnerability. "I do not dream, Sir Nicholas," she said, her voice flat. He raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Everyone dreams, Lady Cecily. Even relentless blades." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "Dreams are for other people, for those who have options, for those who have freedom." "And you do not have freedom?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, angry at herself for showing such weakness. "My life is determined. By my family, by my duty, by my gift." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he did not touch her. "Your gift is a burden, is it not?" She nodded, unable to speak. The truth, for once, was too raw, too painful to conceal. "It does not have to be," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It could be a strength, a weapon, a tool for good." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "How?" she whispered. "How can it be anything but a curse?" His silence was her answer for a long breath, where she was sure she might break into pieces and it would be his fault, not from what he would do, but for what he made her feel. He was dangerous. "Perhaps," he said finally, Perhaps that is something we can discover together. The unsaid hung heavy between them, and she suddenly realized she had revealed far too much. The gardens no longer felt safe. Chapter 6. The Serpent's Coil. The arrival of Lord Beaumont, Cecily's former betrothed, threw Ravensshire into a renewed state of upheaval. He arrived unannounced, a whirlwind of arrogance and barely concealed malice, his retinue of guards and servants filling the courtyard with unwanted noise and activity. Cecily watched his arrival from a window high in the castle tower, her stomach clenching with a familiar dread. Beaumont, the man she had almost married, the man who had nearly destroyed her. The memory of his cruelty, his possessiveness, his cold, calculating ambition, still haunted her nightmares. She had escaped him once, through a combination of luck and desperate maneuvering, but she knew that he had not forgotten, that he still harbored a grudge. His presence at Ravensshire could only mean trouble. He was a serpent, coiling himself around his prey, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. She had to find out why he was here, what he wanted, and how to protect herself and her family from his venomous schemes. The whispers of the castle offered some clues. Beaumont's servants gossiped freely, their conversations revealing snippets of their master's plans. He was deeply in debt, his estates mismanaged, his reputation tarnished. He was seeking a new alliance, a new source of wealth and power. And he had set his sights on Ravensshire. Cecily shared her concerns with Edmund, but her brother, ever eager to please those he perceived as powerful, dismissed her worries. Beaumont is a valuable ally, he said, his eyes gleaming with ambition. His connections at court are extensive. He can help us advance our position. Cecily tried to reason with him, to warn him of Beaumont's treacherous nature, but Edmund refused to listen. He was blinded by his own ambition, by his desire to climb the ladder of royal favor. He saw Beaumont as a stepping stone, not a serpent. Warwick, however, was more perceptive. He observed Beaumont with a careful, calculating gaze, his eyes missing nothing. He listened to the whispers of the castle, he questioned the servants, he analyzed Beaumont's every move. He saw the danger, the threat, the hidden agenda. One evening, after a strained and uncomfortable dinner with Beaumont, Warwick found Cecily alone in the library. She was sitting by the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape, her mind troubled. "He is dangerous, Cecily," Warwick said, his voice low and serious. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I know," she replied. "But Edmund will not listen." "Edmund is a fool," Warwick said bluntly. "He is blinded by ambition." "What can I do?" she asked, her voice desperate. I will not let him harm my family." Warwick studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "You have a gift, Cecily," he said. "Use it." I am afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. He knows my weakness. He knows how to hurt me." Warwick stepped closer, his presence filling the small space. "He will not hurt you," he said, his voice firm. "I will not allow it." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver of something through her. It was not just reassurance, it was a promise of protection, of support, of something more. "We need to find out what he is planning," Warwick said. "We need to gather evidence, to expose his treachery."
"How?" she asked.
"He is careful. He covers his tracks." "He may be careful," Warwick said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "But he is not invisible. Every action leaves a trace, every secret leaves a whisper. We just need to find them." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he did not touch her. "Will you help me, Cecily?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "Will you use your gift to protect your family?" She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw strength, determination, and a flicker of something else. Something that resonated with the hidden depths within her own soul. She nodded, her voice firm. "I will." Together, they began to unravel Beaumont's plot. Cecily used her gift, delving into the whispers of the castle, listening to the echoes of conversations, touching objects that Beaumont had handled, piecing together the fragments of information. Warwick used his skills of observation, his knowledge of courtly intrigue, his network of informants, to gather additional evidence. It was a dangerous game, a dance of deception and counter-deception. Beaumont was suspicious, watchful, his eyes constantly following Cecily. He was trying to manipulate her, to intimidate her, to force her back into submission. But Cecily was no longer the frightened, vulnerable girl she had once been. She had found a strength within herself, a courage she had not known she possessed. And she had an ally, a protector, a man who believed in her, who trusted her, who she pushed the thought away, unwilling to examine it too closely. She could not afford to be distracted, to be vulnerable. She had to focus on the task at hand, on protecting her family, on defeating Beaumont. The hunt was on, and he was no longer hunting her. She was hunting him. He did not see the trap, but it was laid. Chapter 7. A Dance of Deception. The castle became a stage for an intricate dance of deception. Cecily played the part of the compliant, submissive lady, offering Beaumont veiled smiles and carefully worded compliments, all the while gathering information, listening to the whispers, searching for the key to his downfall. Warwick remained in the shadows, observing, analyzing, and orchestrating a counterplot of his own. Beaumont, confident in his own cunning, believed he had Cecily under his control. He saw her as a pawn, a tool to be used to achieve his ambitions. He showered her with unwanted attention, with gifts and promises, trying to win her over, to bind her to him once again. Cecily endured his advances with a carefully constructed facade of politeness. She accepted his gifts, she listened to his promises, she even allowed him to escort her on walks through the gardens. But beneath the surface, her mind was racing, her senses on high alert. One evening, Beaumont hosted a lavish banquet in the Great Hall. He invited nobles from neighboring estates, eager to display his wealth and influence, to solidify his position as a potential ally. The hall was filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and the underlying stench of ambition and deceit. Cecily wore a gown of deep crimson, the color of blood, a deliberate choice, a silent declaration of defiance. She moved through the crowd with grace and poise, her smile fixed, her eyes watchful. She listened to the conversations around her, filtering the gossip, searching for any hint of Beaumont's true intentions. She overheard snippets of conversation that confirmed her suspicions. Beaumont was planning to marry her, not for love, but for her family's wealth and influence. He intended to use Ravensshire as a base of operations, to rebuild his fortune, to reclaim his lost power. He was also involved in a secret plot with a group of disgruntled nobles, a plot that threatened the stability of the kingdom and the king's rule. Cecily shared her findings with Warwick, their meetings taking place in secret, in the hidden corners of the castle, in the dead of night. They pieced together the fragments of information, like a mosaic, revealing the full extent of Beaumont's treachery. "He is planning to overthrow the king," Cecily whispered, her voice trembling with fear and outrage. He is a traitor." Warwick's eyes hardened, his expression turning grim.
"We need proof," he said.
"Something concrete, something undeniable." I think I know where to find it," Cecily said. She had felt a strong pull, a whisper of something hidden, coming from Beaumont's private chambers. "It is dangerous," Warwick said. "He is always guarded." "I can do it," Cecily said, her voice firm. "I have to." The next day, Cecily found an opportunity to slip away unnoticed. While Beaumont was occupied with his guests, she made her way to his chambers, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The room was lavishly decorated, filled with expensive furniture, tapestries, and artwork. The air was heavy with the scent of Beaumont's cloying perfume, a scent that made Cecily's stomach churn. She began to search, her fingers brushing against the objects, listening to the whispers. She felt a growing sense of unease, a sense of darkness, of hidden malice. She found it hidden in a locked chest, beneath a pile of silk clothes. A small, leather-bound book, filled with Beaumont's neat, precise handwriting. It was a detailed record of his treasonous plot, listing the names of his co-conspirators, outlining their plans, detailing their resources. It was the proof they needed. As she slipped the book into the folds of her skirt, she heard a noise behind her. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Beaumont stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing with fury. He had discovered her. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. Cecily froze, her mind racing. She was trapped. And she knew, looking at his face twisted with rage, that her carefully constructed dance was over. The music had stopped. Chapter 8. Scars of the Past. Beaumont advanced, his hand reaching out to grab her, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and a cruel satisfaction. "You little spy," he snarled. "I knew I couldn't trust you. You're just like your mother, sneaking around, prying into things that don't concern you." The mention of her mother, a woman Cecily had barely known but who had been branded a traitor and had died in disgrace, was like a dagger to her heart. It was a low blow, a deliberate attempt to wound her, to break her spirit. "I am nothing like her," Cecily said, her voice trembling but firm. She held her ground, refusing to cower before him. "Oh, but you are," Beaumont sneered. "You have the same tainted blood, the same weakness." He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "I should have known better than to think I could control you. But don't worry, my dear. I'll find a way to silence you."
Permanently.
Cecily struggled against his grip, but he was too strong. She felt a surge of panic, of desperation. She had to escape, to warn Warwick, to expose Beaumont's treachery. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the doorway, blocking Beaumont's path. It was Warwick, his face a mask of cold fury, his sword drawn. "Release her, Beaumont," Warwick said, his voice a deadly calm. Beaumont froze, his eyes widening in surprise and fear. He had not expected Warwick's intervention. He had underestimated him, just as he had underestimated Cecily. "Warwick," Beaumont stammered. This is a private matter. A family dispute. It is a matter of treason," Warwick said, his voice unwavering. "And treason is the king's business." He advanced, his sword pointing at Beaumont's chest. Beaumont released Cecily, stumbling backward, his face pale with terror. "You have no proof," Beaumont blustered. It's her word against mine." Cecily stepped forward, holding up the leather-bound book. "I have proof," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Your own words, Beaumont. Your own confession." Beaumont's eyes darted from Cecily to the book to Warwick, his expression a mixture of disbelief and despair. He was trapped, his carefully constructed plot exposed, his ambitions shattered. Warwick gestured with his sword. "Take him," he said to the guards who had followed him into the room, "and lock him in the dungeon. He will await the king's judgment." The guards seized Beaumont, dragging him away, his protests and curses echoing through the corridor. Cecily stood there, trembling, her body aching from Beaumont's grip, her mind reeling from the events that had just transpired. She had done it. She had exposed Beaumont. She had protected her family. She had saved herself. Warwick sheathed his sword, his gaze turning to her. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without the veil of suspicion, of scrutiny. He saw her strength, her courage, her vulnerability. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, wiping away a stray tear. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with concern. She nodded, unable to speak. The touch of his hand, so gentle, so unexpected, sent a wave of emotion through her. Relief, gratitude, and something more. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. He saw the scars of her past, the wounds that Beaumont had inflicted, the fear that still lingered. "He will not hurt you again," Warwick said, his voice a low murmur. "I promise you." He gently touched the bruise forming where Beaumont gripped her arm. A light touch, but it sent shivers through her. He seemed to notice her reaction, for he pulled his hand back as if burned. He cleared his throat. "The evidence. We must secure it. And inform the king." He looked awkward suddenly, a warrior out of his element. Cecily managed a weak smile, the first genuine smile she had felt in days. Of course, she said, her voice still trembling slightly. I will take it to the library. It will be safe there. He nodded, relief evident in his eyes. I will see to Beaumont. He backed away, almost stumbling. It was odd to see the usually stoic warrior so unsettled. He turned to go. Sir Nicholas? Cecily said softly. He paused at the doorframe, half turning. Thank you. His answering smile was small, but genuine. It was my duty, Lady Cecily. He left, then, and she was left alone. But the feeling in the room was not the oppressive weight of the past any longer. It was lighter. She touched her arm, where his fingers had been. She wasn't alone anymore. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. Chapter 9. The Raven's Flight. News of Beaumont's arrest and the discovery of his treasonous plot spread through Ravensshire like wildfire. The castle was abuzz with whispers, speculation, and a sense of collective relief. Edmund, initially shocked and disbelieving, was forced to confront the truth of his misjudgment. He apologized to Cecily, his voice filled with remorse and a newfound respect for his sister's courage and intelligence. Cecily, however, found little satisfaction in her victory. The ordeal had left her drained, both physically and emotionally. The scars of her past, reopened by Beaumont's cruelty, were still raw and painful. She retreated to her chambers, seeking solitude and a respite from the constant attention and the swirling whispers of the castle. Warwick, meanwhile, took charge of the situation. He secured the evidence, dispatched a messenger to the king, and oversaw the interrogation of Beaumont's co-conspirators. He was efficient, decisive, and utterly in control, the epitome of the king's relentless blade. But he also made time for Cecily. He checked on her frequently, his concern evident in his eyes, in his gentle inquiries. In the small, thoughtful gestures he made, a warm cloak left on her chair, a cup of her favorite herbal tea brought to her room, a book of poetry placed on her bedside table. He did not press her to talk, to reveal her feelings, to relive the trauma of her encounter with Beaumont. He simply was there, a steady, reassuring presence, a silent offer of support and protection. One afternoon, Cecily found herself drawn to the battlements, the same spot where she had stood on the day of Warwick's arrival, the hawk circling overhead. The wind whipped at her cloak, the gray sky mirroring the turmoil within her. She felt lost, adrift, uncertain of her future, of her place in the world. She closed her eyes, breathing in the crisp, autumn air, trying to find a center of calm within the storm. She felt a presence beside her, and opened her eyes to see Warwick standing there, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He will pay for what he did, Warwick said, his voice low and firm, breaking the silence. He did not need to specify who he was. Cecily nodded, unable to speak. The thought of Beaumont's punishment brought her little comfort. It did not erase the pain, the fear, the humiliation. You are brave, Warwick said, his eyes turning to her. Braver than you know. She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. I was terrified, she whispered. Fear is not a weakness, Cecily, Warwick said, his voice gentle. It is a reminder that we are alive, that we have something to lose, something to protect. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he did not touch her. You protected your family, he said. You protected your home. You protected yourself. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She saw compassion, understanding, and something more. Something that made her heart beat faster. Something that both frightened and intrigued her. I could not have done it without you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that transformed his hard features, making him look younger, softer. You would have found a way, he said. You are stronger than you think. He paused, his gaze shifting back to the horizon. I have seen many things in my life, Cecily, he said, his voice low and somber. Many battles, many betrayals, many losses. I have learned to trust few, to keep my distance, to protect myself. He turned to her again, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she had not seen before. But you have reminded me that there is still good in the world, that there is still hope, that there is still something worth fighting for. His words, spoken with such sincerity, touched her deeply. They resonated with the hidden longings within her own soul, with the yearning for connection, for trust, for love. She reached out, her hand covering his, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken bond between them. It was a small gesture, a fleeting touch, but it felt profound. A connection forged in the midst of danger, of betrayal, of shared vulnerability. "What will happen now?" she asked, her voice soft. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "The king will decide Beaumont's fate," he said. And I will return to court." His words, though expected, sent a pang of disappointment through her. She had known that he would leave, that his duty to the king would take him away from Ravensshire. But she had not realized how much his presence had come to mean to her, how much she had come to rely on his strength, his support, his company. "And in you?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "What will you do?" She looked out at the landscape, at the rolling hills, the dense forests, the distant mountains. She saw not a prison, but a possibility. Not a cage, but a sanctuary. "I will stay here," she said, her voice firm. "This is my home. This is where I belong." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "And I will find my own way," she said. I will use my gift for good. I will be free." She was not running, but soaring, like the raven on her family crest, finally taking flight. He smiled at her, and it felt like the sun finally breaking through the clouds. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Chapel. The days following Warwick's departure were filled with a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Ravensshire returned to its normal rhythm, the echoes of Beaumont's treachery fading into the background noise of daily life. Edmund, humbled and chastened, focused on repairing his damaged reputation and rebuilding his relationship with his sister. Cecily, however, found it difficult to settle back into her old routine. Warwick's presence had stirred something within her, awakened a part of her that had long been dormant. She missed his quiet strength, his insightful observations, his unexpected gentleness. She missed their conversations, their shared purpose, their connection. She spent hours in the chapel, seeking solace in the quiet sanctuary, in the familiar rituals, in the whispered prayers. The chapel was a place of peace, a place where she could connect with something larger than herself, something beyond the turmoil of her earthly life. The whispers of the chapel were different from the whispers of the castle. They were softer, gentler, more spiritual. They spoke of faith, of hope, of forgiveness, of love. One evening, as she knelt before the altar, her gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight, she heard a whisper that was different from the others. It was not a voice, not a word, but a feeling, a sense of longing, a yearning for connection, a whisper of Warwick. She closed her eyes, her heart beating faster. She had tried to suppress her feelings for him, to convince herself that they were foolish, unrealistic, impossible. He was a knight, a warrior, the king's enforcer. She was a lady, a recluse, a reader of whispers. Their worlds were too different, their paths too divergent. But the whispers of the chapel could not be denied. They spoke of a connection that transcended social boundaries, that defied logic, that resonated with the deepest desires of her soul. She opened her eyes, her gaze drawn to a small, stained glass window depicting a scene of a knight rescuing a maiden from a dragon. The image was a familiar one, a classic tale of chivalry and romance. But tonight, it seemed to hold a new significance, a new meaning. She remembered Warwick's words, his promise to protect her, his belief in her strength, his vulnerability. She remembered the touch of his hand, the look in his eyes, the unspoken connection between them. She realized that she was not alone in her feelings. That Warwick, too, felt something for her. Something that he had tried to hide, to suppress, but that had nevertheless emerged. A flicker of hope ignited within her, a fragile flame in the darkness. Perhaps it was not impossible. Perhaps there was a chance for them. She rose from her knees, her heart filled with a newfound determination. She would not give up. She would not let fear, or doubt, or social convention stand in her way. She would find a way to reach him, to tell him how she felt, to explore the possibility of a future together. She left the chapel, her steps lighter, her spirit renewed. The whispers of the chapel had given her strength, had given her courage, had given her hope. As she walked through the dimly lit corridors, she felt a sudden, sharp pull, a whisper of something urgent coming from the library. She hesitated, unsure whether to investigate. But the pull was too strong to ignore. She made her way to the library, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the tall windows. She felt a sense of unease, a sense of something hidden. She lit a candle, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the rows of ancient tomes and scrolls. She searched the room, her fingers brushing against the objects, listening to the whispers. She found it hidden behind a tapestry, a small, wooden box. She opened the box, her hands trembling. Inside, she found a letter, addressed to her, in Warwick's handwriting. She unfolded the letter, her heart racing. The words were brief, stark, and devastating. Cecily, I am being sent on a mission. A dangerous one. I do not know if I will return. I must tell you I care for you. Deeply. More than I thought possible. But my duty, my loyalty must come first. Forgive me, Nicholas. The candle nearly slipped from her fingers. She held the letter tight, rereading the words as if they would change. They did not. Her newfound hope shattered in that instant. The chapel's promise felt like a cruel trick. Chapter 11. The Weight of a Crown. Cecily sank onto a nearby chair, the letter clutched in her trembling hand. The words swam before her eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible mess of ink and despair. Warwick was gone. Sent on a dangerous mission. Possibly never to return. The whispers of the library swirled around her, a cacophony of regrets, of lost opportunities, of unspoken words. She felt a wave of grief wash over her, a profound sense of loss that threatened to consume her. She had allowed herself to hope, to dream, to believe in the possibility of a future with him. And now it was all gone. Shattered. Destroyed. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She remembered his smile, his touch, his voice, his strength, his vulnerability. She remembered the connection they had shared, the unspoken bond that had grown between them. She had been a fool, a naive, foolish girl, to believe that a man like Warwick, a knight sworn to the king, could ever be hers. Their worlds were too different, their paths too divergent. Duty, loyalty, honor, these were the things that mattered to him. Not love, not her. She rose from the chair, her legs shaky, her body aching. She walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. The world seemed cold, empty, devoid of meaning. She crumpled the letter in her fist, her anger rising, mixing with her grief. He had not even given her a chance.
He had not even said goodbye.
He had simply left, leaving her with nothing but a few words on a piece of parchment and a heart full of shattered dreams. She would not cry. She would not mourn. She would not allow herself to feel. She had learned that lesson before, the hard way. Feelings were a weakness, a vulnerability. They led to pain, to disappointment, to loss. She would bury her feelings. She would lock them away. She would forget him. She would return to her old life, to her quiet existence, to her loneliness. She spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions of daily life, but feeling nothing. She avoided Edmund. She avoided the servants. She avoided everyone. She retreated into herself, building walls around her heart, protecting herself from further pain. One morning, a messenger arrived from the king. He brought a sealed letter, addressed to Lord Edmund, but also a small, wooden box, addressed to Lady Cecily. Cecily's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the box. It was the same box she had found in the library, the box that had contained Warwick's letter. She took the box, her hands trembling. She excused herself, retreating to her chambers, her mind racing.
What could it be?
Another letter? A farewell gift. A final goodbye? She opened the box, her heart pounding. Inside, she found not a letter, but a single object. A small, silver falcon, intricately crafted, its wings spread in flight. It was a beautiful piece, a work of art, but it was also something more. It was a symbol of the king, a symbol of Warwick, a symbol of hope. She turned the falcon over in her hands, her fingers tracing the delicate details. She felt a faint whisper, a whisper of Warwick. His touch, his presence, his love. She closed her eyes, her heart aching. He had not forgotten her. He had not abandoned her. He had sent her a message, a silent message, a promise? She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the silver falcon. A flicker of hope, rekindled, burned within her. Perhaps it was not over. Perhaps there was still a chance. A royal decree was to be read in the great hall. She would not hide. She would not be silent, but she would hear what the king had to say. And she would decide, then, what came next. The falcon felt heavy in her hand, as heavy as a crown. Chapter 12. A promise forged in fire. The great hall was packed. Nobles from across the region had gathered, summoned by the royal decree. The air was thick with anticipation, speculation, and a sense of unease. King Alaric was known for his unpredictable nature, his iron fist, his ruthlessness. Cecily stood beside Edmund, her posture straight, her expression composed, but her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a flicker of hope. She clutched the silver falcon in her hand, hidden within the folds of her gown, its presence a silent source of strength and uncertainty. The herald stepped forward, unfurling the royal scroll, his voice booming through the hall. He announced the king's victory over a rebellious faction in the north, a victory that had secured the kingdom's borders and solidified the king's power. He then announced the king's gratitude to those who had served him loyally, rewarding them with titles, lands, and favors. Finally, he announced the king's justice upon those who had betrayed him, condemning them to imprisonment, exile, and death. Beaumont's name was among them, his sentence execution. Cecily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Beaumont was gone, his threat extinguished. But the relief was mixed with a sense of sadness. Sadness for the wasted life, for the twisted ambition, for the lost soul. The herald then announced one final piece of news, a news that sent a shockwave through the assembled nobles. His Majesty, King Alaric, the herald proclaimed, his voice ringing with authority in recognition of his unwavering loyalty, his exceptional service, and his invaluable contribution to the security of the realm, has decreed that Sir Nicholas Warwick, the king's relentless blade, shall be elevated. A hush fell over the hall, the silence broken only by the crackling of the torches and the beating of Cecily's heart. Sir Nicholas Warwick, the herald continued, shall be granted the title of Lord Protector of the Northern Marches. He shall be given dominion over Ravensshire. Cecily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ravensshire. Warwick was Lord of Ravensshire. He was her lord. The whispers of the hall erupted, a cacophony of surprise, speculation, and awe. Edmund looked stunned, his face a mixture of disbelief and resentment. The other nobles exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from envy to fear. Cecily felt a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, confusion, disbelief, and a surge of something else. Something that felt like hope, but also fear. Warwick was not dead. He was alive. And he was coming back. But not as a knight, not as the king's enforcer, but as a lord. As her lord. What did it mean? What would it change? What would it become? As the herald concluded the decree and the assembled nobles began to disperse, a figure appeared at the entrance of the great hall. Tall, imposing, clad in armor, his face scarred. Warwick. He stood there, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, his eyes searching. He found her. He walked towards her, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted before him, like the Red Sea before Moses. He stopped before her, his eyes locking with hers. He looked different. Tired, weary, but also stronger. The scar on his face, a fresh wound, a testament to his recent battle, only added to his aura of command. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "Cecily," he said, his voice a low murmur, a sound that resonated deep within her soul. You are alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I am," he said, "and I am home." "But the letter," she said, her voice confused. "You said you did not know if you would return." He reached into his tunic, pulling out another letter, a crumpled, stained piece of parchment. It was the letter she had found in the library, the letter she had believed to be his farewell. "I wrote that letter," he said, his voice low and somber. "Before the battle. I wanted you to know how I felt, in case I did not survive." He paused, his gaze searching hers.
"But I did survive," he said.
And I have been given a second chance. A chance to build a new life. A chance to be with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Cecily's mind was reeling. It was all so sudden. "The king," he continued, "knows of your gift."
He was impressed.
"He believes, as I do, that you can help me. Help me rule. Help me bring peace to this land." "But Ravensshire, it is my brothers," she finally managed. Warwick looked at Edmund, who stood a short distance away, watching them with a mixture of resentment and awe. "Edmund has been compensated," Warwick said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "He has been granted lands in the south. A new title. A new opportunity." He looked back at Cecily, his gaze softening. "He will do well there. He has learned from his mistakes." Cecily saw her brother and knew Warwick was right, and saw his relief in being set free. Warwick's gaze returned to hers, and this time he did not pause before taking her hand, his touch warm and firm. "Cecily," he said, his voice a low murmur that only she could hear, "I have been given a second chance. And I am asking you to share it with me. To be my lady.
To be my wife."
His words were simple, direct, but they resonated with the depth of his feelings, with the promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. The great hall faded away. Only he was real. The choice, the decision, the future were all hers. It was terrifying and wonderful. Chapter 13. Between Duty and Desire. Cecily stared at Warwick, her mind struggling to reconcile the whirlwind of events. The king's decree, Warwick's return, his scarred face, his elevation to Lord of Ravensshire, and now his proposal. It was too much, too sudden, too overwhelming. She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception, of manipulation, of anything other than sincerity. But she found only honesty and love. A love that was raw, untamed, and terrifying in its intensity. Her hand trembled in his, the silver falcon still clutched tightly in her other hand. She remembered the fear, the loneliness, the despair she had felt after reading his letter. She remembered the walls she had built around her heart, the vows she had made to herself to never be vulnerable again. But she also remembered the connection they had shared, the trust they had built, the way he made her feel.
Alive.
Strong.
Worthy.
She looked around the great hall, at the faces of the assembled nobles, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, speculation, and envy. She saw Edmund, watching them with a resigned acceptance. She saw the weight of expectation, the burden of duty, the demands of their world. She knew what was expected of her. To accept Warwick's proposal, to become Lady of Ravensshire, to fulfill her duty to her family, to her people. It was the logical choice, the sensible choice, the expected choice. But was it her choice? She looked back at Warwick, his gaze unwavering, his hand firm and warm in hers. She saw the hope in his eyes, the vulnerability, the silent plea. She thought of her gift, the whispers she could hear, the secrets she could uncover. She thought of the power she possessed, the power to help him, to guide him, to make a difference. She thought of the life she had always wanted, a life of purpose, of meaning, of love. A life that was not dictated by duty, by tradition, by fear, but a life of her own choosing, a life lived on her own terms. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her decision. "Nicholas," she said, her voice trembling but firm, her gaze locking with his. She paused, her words catching in her throat. The whispers of the hall seemed to fade away, the faces of the nobles blurring into insignificance. Only Warwick remained, his presence filling her world, his eyes searching hers. "I cannot give you an answer," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not yet." His expression did not change, his hand did not waver. He simply waited, patient, understanding. "I need time," she said. "Time to think. Time to understand. Time to be sure." "Take all the time you need, Cecily," he said, his voice gentle, his gaze unwavering. "I will wait." She withdrew her hand from his, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin. She turned and walked away, her steps slow but deliberate, her head held high. She left the great hall, leaving behind the whispers, the expectations, the weight of the world. She walked towards the gardens, towards the open air, towards herself. She needed to be alone, to think, to feel. She needed to listen to her own heart, to her own whispers, to find her own truth. She reached the gardens, the cool air caressing her face, the scent of autumn leaves filling her senses. She sat down on the stone bench, the same bench where they had sat together before, the bench where he had asked her about her dreams. She closed her eyes, the silver falcon still clutched in her hand. She listened to the whispers of the wind, to the rustling of the leaves, to the beating of her own heart. She realized that she was afraid. Afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of disappointing him, afraid of being hurt again.
But she was also excited.
Excited by the possibilities, by the challenge, by the promise of love. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. She saw a future that was uncertain, a future that was challenging, but also a future that was hers. She knew that she could not run from her duty, from her responsibility, from her destiny. But she also knew that she could not deny her heart, her feelings, her love. She did not want to be a pawn. She wanted to be a partner. She stood up, and for the first time the castle felt different. It was not a cage nor a haven. It was a responsibility, and she was ready to accept it on her own terms. She walked back towards the castle, ready to find Warwick, but on her own terms, not as a rescued maiden, but an equal partner. She knew the path ahead was filled with choices, but this time, she had a voice. And it was clear. Chapter 14. The Hunt Begins. Cecily found Warwick in the library, standing by the window, gazing out at the same view she had contemplated just moments before. He turned as she entered, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Cecily," he said, his voice a low murmur. Have you decided?" She walked towards him, her steps measured, her heart steady. She stopped before him, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence, to see the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I have," she said, her voice clear and firm. "But before I give you my answer, I need to ask you something." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Anything." "Why me?" she asked, her voice direct, her eyes searching his. Why do you want to marry me? Is it because of my gift? Because of Ravensshire? Because of the king's decree?" His expression softened, a faint smile touching his lips. "Your gift is valuable," he admitted. "Ravensshire is important. And the king's decree is a command. But those are not the reasons why I want to marry you." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I want to marry you, Cecily," he said, his voice low and sincere. Because I love you. Because I admire you. Because I respect you. Because you make me want to be a better man." His words, spoken with such honesty, with such vulnerability, melted the last of her doubts, the last of her fears. She felt a wave of emotion wash over her, a profound sense of relief, of gratitude, of love. And what do you want, Nicholas?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. What do you dream of? He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his hard features, making him look younger, softer.
I dream of peace, he said.
Of a life free from war, from betrayal, from loss. I dream of a home, a family, a future with you. She reached out, her hand covering his, their fingers intertwining. And what if I am not what you expect? She asked, her voice hesitant. What if I disappoint you? He squeezed her hand gently, his gaze unwavering. You could never disappoint me, Cecily, he said. You are more than I ever dared to hope for. You are strong, courageous, intelligent, compassionate. You are everything I have ever wanted. She took a deep breath, her heart overflowing with love, with hope, with a sense of belonging. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that there would be challenges, obstacles, and uncertainties. But she also knew that she would not be alone, that she would have Warwick by her side, her partner, her protector, her love. Then yes, she said, her voice clear and strong, her gaze locking with his. Yes, Nicholas. I will marry you. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the security of his love. We have much to do, he said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. We need to prepare for the wedding, to inform the king, to establish our rule over Ravensshire. She nodded, her head against his chest. And there's something else, she said, her voice muffled. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. What is it?
There are whispers, she said.
Whispers of discontent, of a new threat, of a plot against the king. A plot that may be connected to Beaumont's treachery. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. Tell me, he said, his voice turning grim. She told him everything she had heard, the fragmented whispers, the vague hints, the unsettling premonitions. She told him about the feeling of darkness, of hidden danger, that she had sensed in the castle, in the surrounding lands. We need to investigate, she said. We need to uncover the truth, to protect the king, to protect ourselves. He nodded, his mind already racing, analyzing the information, formulating a plan. We will, he said, his voice firm. We will do it together. He reached out, his hand gently touching the silver falcon that she still clutched in her hand. We will be the falcon and the raven, he said, his voice a low murmur. Working together, watching over the realm, protecting our home. He then kissed her. It was not a tentative touch, nor a chaste peck. It was firm, possessive, and full of all the things that had gone unsaid between them. When they finally broke apart, Cecily felt breathless, but grounded. They had a hunt to plan, and a wedding, but the hunt came first. Chapter 15. A Revelation in the Mist. The investigation began immediately. Cecily and Warwick, now formally betrothed, worked in tandem, utilizing their unique skills and resources to uncover the truth behind the growing whispers of discontent. Cecily delved into the subtle energies of Ravensshire and its surrounding areas, listening to the echoes of conversations, touching objects, and seeking out hidden clues. Warwick, with his military experience and network of informants, focused on gathering tangible evidence, interrogating potential suspects, and analyzing strategic movements. The atmosphere at Ravensshire shifted. The initial joy and relief following Beaumont's downfall and Warwick's elevation were replaced by a sense of focused determination and underlying tension. The servants, the guards, and even the local villagers sensed the change, their whispers reflecting a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Cecily discovered that the whispers were strongest in the nearby forests, particularly around an ancient, abandoned monastery that lay shrouded in mist and legend. The monastery had a dark history, rumored to be a place of forbidden rituals, of hidden secrets, and of untimely deaths. She shared her findings with Warwick, her voice trembling slightly as she described the unsettling feeling of oppression that she had sensed emanating from the monastery.
It feels wrong, she said.
Like a wound that has never healed. a place of pain and betrayal. Warwick listened intently, his expression grim. He knew the history of the monastery, the tales of its dark past, the rumors of its lingering curse.
"We need to go there," he said, his voice firm. "We need to see it for ourselves.
To uncover the truth." They prepared for their journey, gathering a small contingent of trusted guards, equipping themselves with weapons and supplies, and preparing themselves mentally for whatever they might find. The journey to the monastery was arduous, the path winding through dense forests, across treacherous streams, and over rocky hills. The air grew colder, the mist thicker, the silence more profound. As they approached the monastery, Cecily felt a growing sense of unease, a sense of imminent danger. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices murmuring warnings, threats, and secrets. The monastery itself was a ruin, a crumbling shell of its former grandeur. The stone walls were cracked and weathered, the roof partially collapsed, the windows empty sockets staring out at the world. They entered the monastery cautiously, their swords drawn, their senses on high alert. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, of damp earth, and of something else. Something unpleasant. Something unholy. Cecily led the way, her gift guiding her through the maze of corridors, through the crumbling chambers, through the remnants of a forgotten past. She felt a pull, a strong, insistent pull, drawing her towards the heart of the monastery, towards the source of the whispers. She reached a large, central chamber, its walls adorned with faded frescoes depicting scenes of religious devotion and scenes of horrific violence. The air in the chamber was thick with oppression, with despair, with a palpable sense of evil. In the center of the chamber, she found it, a hidden altar, concealed behind a crumbling section of wall. The altar was stained with something dark, something ancient, something blood. She touched the altar, her fingers recoiling instinctively from the cold, slick surface. A jolt of energy surged through her, a wave of images and emotions flooding her senses. She saw a vision of a clandestine meeting, a secret ritual, a betrayal. She saw a group of figures, cloaked and hooded, gathered around the altar. She saw them chanting, praying, invoking something dark, something powerful, something evil. She saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a figure she recognized, a figure that made her blood run cold. It was Edmund, her brother. He was not a victim, not a pawn, but a leader, a willing participant in the treasonous plot. Cecily gasped, stumbling backward, her mind reeling from the revelation. Edmund, her own brother, a traitor. Warwick rushed to her side, his arms supporting her, his eyes filled with concern. "Cecily, what is it? What did you see?" She struggled to speak, her voice trembling, her words barely a whisper. "Edmund," she said. He is involved. He is one of them." Warwick's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. He had suspected Edmund's involvement, but to have it confirmed, to see it through Cecily's eyes, was a blow. "We need to find him," Warwick said, his voice grim. "We needed to stop him. Before it is too late." The vision Cecily had was not the past, but the present, or near future. This was not an echo, but a plan. And they were running out of time. Edmund was not just part of the conspiracy, he was pivotal to it. The pieces started to fall into place, and the picture was darker than they thought. Chapter 16. The Lion's Denver. The revelation of Edmund's treachery sent a shockwave through Cecily and Warwick's already tense preparations. They returned to Ravenshire, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily upon them. The joyous anticipation of their wedding felt distant, overshadowed by the looming threat posed by Edmund and his conspirators. Cecily struggled to reconcile the image of her brother, the Edmund she had known and loved, with the traitor she had seen in her vision. The whispers of the castle, once a source of comfort and guidance, now seemed to mock her, echoing with the betrayal that had taken root within her own family. Warwick, ever the strategist, immediately set about gathering information and preparing for a confrontation. He strengthened the castle's defenses, dispatched scouts to track Edmund's movements, and sent a coded message to the king, requesting reinforcements and outlining the dire situation. He found Cecily in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, her head bowed in prayer. He approached her quietly, his footsteps echoing in the silent sanctuary. He knelt beside her, his presence a source of comfort and strength. He was always so ambitious, Cecily whispered, her voice choked with emotion. So eager to please, to gain power. Warwick reached out, his hand gently covering hers. Ambition can be a dangerous thing, Cecily, he said. It can corrupt. It can destroy.
But why?
She asked, her eyes searching his. Why would he betray his own family? Betray his own kingdom? Warwick sighed, his expression somber.
Power, he said. Greed.
Revenge. There are many reasons why men choose the path of treachery. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. We may never know the full extent of his motives, he said. But we must stop him. Before he causes any more harm. Cecily nodded, her heart heavy with grief and a sense of resolve. She would not allow her brother's betrayal to break her. She would fight. For her kingdom, for her love, for her future. They received word from their scouts that Edmund had been sighted near the border, gathering support from disgruntled lords and mercenaries. He was planning to march on Ravensheim, to seize the castle, and to use it as a base of operations for his rebellion. Warwick knew that they had to act quickly. They could not wait for the king's reinforcements. They had to confront Edmund, to stop him before he could launch his attack. They decided to ride out to meet Edmund, to attempt to reason with him, to offer him a chance to surrender. It was a dangerous plan, a gamble, but it was the only option they had. They gathered a small force of their most trusted knights and rode out from Ravensheim, their hearts heavy with apprehension and a flicker of hope. They met Edmund and his forces in a clearing near the border, a place where ancient battles had been fought, a place where blood had been spilled. Edmund stood at the head of his troops, his face hardened, his eyes filled with a cold, unfamiliar light. He looked different, older, harder, and utterly devoid of the warmth and affection Cecily had once known. Warwick rode forward, his voice booming across the clearing. Edmund, he called out.
Stand down.
Surrender your forces. It is not too late to turn back. Edmund laughed, a cold, harsh sound that sent a shiver down Cecily's spine. Turn back? He sneered. I have come too far to turn back. I am taking what is rightfully mine. Ravensheim.
Power.
And revenge. Revenge for what? Warwick asked, his voice unwavering. For your own failures? For your own misjudgments? Edmund's eyes narrowed, his face contorting with rage. You took everything from me, he shouted. My title, my lands, my future. You gave them away, Edmund. Cecily cried out, her voice filled with anguish. You chose this path. You chose treachery. Edmund's gaze turned to Cecily, his eyes filled with hatred. You, he spat. You were always the favorite, the clever one, the one who could see things others could not. But you will not see this coming. He raised his hand, signaling his troops to attack. The clearing erupted in chaos, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the dying filling the air. The battle was joined, and Cecily found herself in the middle of it, not as a bystander, but as a combatant. She had to reach Edmund, to stop him, to save him from himself. But he seemed to be protected by an invisible force. He was heading to the king. It was all a trap, all a ruse. This was just the beginning. She had to warn Warwick. And she had to get out alive. Chapter 17. Threads of Treachery. Cecily fought her way through the chaos of the battle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to reach Warwick, to warn him of Edmund's true intentions, to save him from the trap that was closing around them. She saw him in the distance, fighting fiercely, his sword a blur of motion, his presence a beacon of strength and courage in the midst of the swirling melee. But she also saw the trap, the subtle movements of Edmund's forces, the calculated positioning of his archers, the hidden daggers glinting in the sunlight. Nicholas! She cried out, her voice barely audible above the din of battle. It's a trap. Edmund, he is heading to the king. Warwick heard her, his head turning, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. He understood. He saw the trap, the danger, the imminent threat. He reacted instantly, his movements swift and decisive. He rallied his knights, cutting a path through the enemy forces, moving towards Cecily, towards safety. But Edmund's forces were too numerous, too well-positioned, too determined. They closed in, surrounding Warwick and his men, cutting them off from Cecily, from escape. Cecily watched in horror as Warwick fought, his strength and skill unmatched, but his situation hopeless. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. She had to do something. She could not stand by and watch him die. She could not lose him. She used her gift, focusing her mind, reaching out to the whispers of the battlefield, searching for a weakness, a vulnerability, a way to help him. She found it. A hidden path, a narrow passage through the trees, a way to escape the trap. She pointed towards the path, shouting to Warwick, her voice desperate, urgent. There. Nicholas. Through the trees. There is a way out. Warwick saw the path. He understood the opportunity. He trusted her. He gave the order, and his knights followed him, cutting their way through the enemy lines, moving towards the hidden passage, towards freedom. But Edmund saw it too. He saw the escape, the failure of his trap. He spurred his horse forward, his eyes filled with rage, his sword raised, determined to stop Warwick, to kill him. Cecily saw the danger, the imminent threat, the finality of Edmund's intent. She reacted instinctively, her gift surging within her, her body moving without conscious thought. She ran towards Edmund, her hands outstretched, her mind focused, her power unleashed. She touched him, her fingers brushing against his armor, a jolt of energy passing between them, a wave of images and emotions flooding her senses. She saw his past, his ambitions, his resentments, his hatred. She saw the darkness that had consumed him, the forces that had driven him to treachery. She saw his plan, his true plan, the ultimate betrayal. He was not just aiming to seize Ravensshire, he was aiming to assassinate the king, to seize the throne for himself. And he was not working alone. He had allies, powerful allies, allies within the king's own court, allies who had manipulated him, used him, and were now waiting for him to complete his mission. The new information was vital. There was more to the plot, a spiderweb stretching far. Cecily staggered back, the force of the vision overwhelming her, her body trembling, her mind reeling. But there was no time to react. She had to warn Nicholas. Edmund, momentarily stunned by Cecily's touch, by the intrusion into his mind, recovered quickly. He raised his sword, his eyes filled with fury, his intent clear. But before he could strike, a figure intervened, a figure that moved with lightning speed, a figure that deflected Edmund's blow, a figure that saved Cecily's life. It was Warwick. He had escaped the trap, he had returned, he had come back for her. He stood between Cecily and Edmund, his sword raised, his body shielding hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and love. "You will not touch her, Edmund," Warwick said, his voice a deadly calm. "You will not harm her. Ever." Edmund lunged, his sword flashing, but Warwick parried the blow, his movements swift and precise. They fought, brother against brother, their swords clashing, their bodies straining, their destinies intertwined. The betrayal cut deep, but Cecily knew she needed to help. The threads of treason had to be cut. And it started here. Chapter 18. A Test of Loyalty. The duel between Warwick and Edmund was brutal and swift. They were both skilled warriors, trained in the art of combat, but their motivations were vastly different. Warwick fought for duty, for loyalty, for love. Edmund fought for ambition, for revenge, for power. Cecily watched, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange sense of sadness. She saw the pain in Warwick's eyes, the anguish he felt at having to fight his betrothed's brother, the man who had once been a friend. She also saw the darkness in Edmund's eyes, the corruption that had consumed him, to the utter lack of remorse or regret. Warwick was stronger, more skilled, and more determined. He disarmed Edmund, his sword knocking Edmund's weapon from his grasp, sending it clattering to the ground. Edmund stumbled backward, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. He was defeated, his plot foiled, his life at Warwick's mercy. Warwick stood over him, his sword pointed at Edmund's throat, his expression unreadable. He could kill him. He could end it all right there. He could avenge the betrayal, the treachery, the threat to Cecily. But he hesitated. He looked at Edmund, his face contorted with rage and despair. He saw not a monster, but a man. A flawed, misguided, and broken man. He lowered his sword, his voice trembling slightly. "I will not kill you, Edmund," he said. "I will not become like you." He gestured to his knights, who had surrounded Edmund, their weapons drawn. "Take him," Warwick said. "Bind him, and deliver him to the king. Let him face justice." The knights seized Edmund, binding his hands, leading him away, his protests and curses fading into the distance. Warwick turned to Cecily, his eyes searching hers. He saw the pain, the relief, the lingering sadness. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with concern. She nodded, unable to speak. The events of the day had taken their toll, leaving her drained, exhausted, and emotionally raw. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight, as if he would never let her go. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the security of his love. "It is over," he whispered, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "He is defeated. He will not harm anyone again." But Cecily knew that it was not over. Not yet. Edmund was just a pawn, a tool in a much larger game. There were others involved, others who were more powerful, more dangerous, and more deeply entrenched. "There are others," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Edmund was not working alone. He had allies. Allies within the king's own court. Warwick stiffened, his body tensing.
He knew that she was right.
The whispers had told her as much. The vision she had experienced at the monastery had confirmed it. "Who?" he asked, his voice grim. "Who are these allies?" Cecily hesitated. She knew the names, she had seen them in her vision, but she was afraid. Afraid of the power they wielded, afraid of the consequences of revealing their identities, afraid of the danger it would put them in. But she also knew that she could not remain silent. She could not allow the treachery to continue. She could not let them win. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked up at Warwick, her eyes meeting his, her gaze unwavering. "Lord Ashford," she said, her voice barely a whisper. And Chancellor Mallory. They're the ones behind it all." Warwick's eyes widened in surprise and disbelief. Lord Ashford was one of the king's most trusted advisors, a man of renowned integrity and unwavering loyalty. Chancellor Mallory was the architect of the king's policies, a man of immense power and influence. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. Cecily nodded, her voice firm.
"I saw them," she said.
"In my vision. They were planning it all with Edmund. They are the masterminds." Warwick knew that Cecily's gift was reliable. He had seen it firsthand. He had witnessed its power. He had come to trust it implicitly. But this was different. This was a direct accusation against two of the most powerful men in the kingdom. This was a challenge to the very foundations of the king's authority. This was a test of loyalty. Not just his, but everyone's. And he knew that the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. He knew the game had changed, and the true enemy was revealed. Chapter 19. The Heart's Reckoning. The revelation of Ashford and Mallory's treachery cast a long shadow over Ravensshire. The joy of Edmund's capture and the imminent wedding of Cecily and Warwick were overshadowed by the looming threat posed by the powerful conspirators within the king's own court. Warwick knew that they had to act cautiously. Accusing two of the king's most trusted advisors without concrete proof could be disastrous, potentially leading to their own downfall. They needed evidence, undeniable evidence, to expose the conspiracy and bring the traitors to justice. He and Cecily spent hours poring over the information they had gathered, analyzing Edmund's confessions, examining the whispers Cecily had gleaned from various objects and locations, and searching for any clue that could link Ashford and Mallory to the plot. They worked in secret, confiding only in a handful of their most trusted allies, knowing that any leak could jeopardize their efforts and endanger their lives. Cecily's gift proved invaluable in their investigation. She was able to piece together fragmented whispers, to uncover hidden connections, to sense the presence of deception and betrayal. She discovered that Ashford and Mallory had been secretly communicating with Edmund through a series of coded letters that were hidden within the king's own correspondence. She also discovered that they had been manipulating the king, feeding him false information and isolating him from his other advisors, making him dependent on their counsel. Their ultimate goal was to overthrow the king, to seize control of the kingdom, and to establish a new order, an order in which they would rule supreme. Warwick, using his military expertise and his network of informants, gathered additional evidence, confirming Cecily's findings and uncovering further details of the conspiracy. He discovered that Ashford and Mallory had been secretly amassing an army, recruiting disgruntled nobles and mercenaries, and preparing to launch a coup d'état. They were planning to strike during the upcoming royal hunt, a time when the king would be vulnerable and away from the protection of his main forces. Warwick and Cecily knew that they had to act quickly. They had to warn the king, to expose the conspirators, and to prevent the coup before it was too late. They decided to travel to the king's court, to present their evidence, and to appeal to the king's sense of justice and loyalty. It was a dangerous journey, a journey fraught with peril, a journey that could cost them their lives. But they were determined. They were united in their purpose. They were in love. As they prepared for their departure, Cecily found herself drawn to the chapel, seeking solace and guidance. She knelt before the altar, her heart heavy with apprehension and a flicker of hope. She prayed for strength, for courage, for protection. She prayed for the king's safety, for the kingdom's stability, for a future free from treachery and betrayal. Warwick found her there, his presence a source of comfort and strength. He knelt beside her, his hand gently touching hers. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with concern. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yes," she admitted. "But I am also determined. I will not let them win. I will fight for what is right." He smiled, a faint, fleeting smile that transformed his hard features. "I know you will," he said. "You are the strongest woman I know, the bravest, the most beautiful." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tender kiss that spoke of love, of devotion, of a promise of a future together. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice a low murmur against her ear, "I will always be by your side. I will always protect you. I will always love you." His words, spoken with such sincerity, filled her heart with a renewed sense of hope and determination. She knew that the journey ahead would be perilous, that the odds were stacked against them, but she was not alone. She had Warwick, and she had her love. They looked at each other one last time, and something unspoken passed between them. It was a promise, a vow. They left the chapel hand in hand, ready to face the storm. This was their reckoning, and they would face it together, heart to heart. Chapter 20. The King's Judgment. The journey to the king's court was tense and fraught with peril. Cecily and Warwick traveled in disguise, avoiding main roads and relying on Warwick's knowledge of hidden paths and secret passages. They knew that Ashford and Mallory's spies were likely watching for them, and any misstep could lead to their capture or worse. Upon reaching the court, they found it a nest of vipers. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, intrigue, and barely concealed animosity. Ashford and Mallory held sway, their influence permeating every corner of the royal household. The king, isolated and manipulated, seemed a shadow of his former self, his usual confidence and decisiveness replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. Warwick and Cecily managed to secure a private audience with the king, a feat achieved through a combination of Warwick's reputation and a carefully orchestrated plea delivered by Cecily, leveraging the memory of her family's past loyalty. They presented their evidence to the king, laying out the intricate web of treachery woven by Ashford and Mallory. Cecily used her gift to amplify the truth, touching objects handled by the conspirators, revealing their whispered conversations, and projecting the images she had seen in her visions. King Alaric listened intently, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger to a profound sense of betrayal. He had trusted Ashford and Mallory implicitly, relying on their counsel and believing in their loyalty. To discover their treachery was a blow to his pride, his judgment, and his heart. I cannot believe it, he said, his voice trembling with rage and disappointment. Ashford, Mallory, they were my most trusted advisors. My friends. They used your trust, your majesty, Warwick said, his voice firm but respectful. They manipulated you. They isolated you. They plotted against you. And Edmund the king said, his voice barely a whisper. My own kinsman. A willing participant in this abomination. Cecily stepped forward, her voice filled with compassion. He was misguided, your majesty, she said. He was driven by ambition and revenge. But he was also a victim of their manipulation. The king looked at Cecily, his eyes searching hers. He saw the truth in her words, the sincerity of her plea, the depth of her loyalty. He rose from his throne, his posture straightening, his eyes hardening with resolve. They will pay for their treachery, he said, his voice ringing with authority. They will face justice. My justice. He ordered the immediate arrest of Ashford and Mallory, summoning his royal guard and instructing them to seize the conspirators and bring them before him. The arrest was swift and decisive. Ashford and Mallory, caught completely off guard, were unable to resist. They were dragged before the king, their faces pale with terror, their arrogance and power stripped away. The king confronted them with the evidence, his voice thundering with righteous anger. They denied the accusations, they pleaded their innocence, they attempted to lie and deceive. But the king was not swayed. He had seen the truth, he had heard the whispers, he had witnessed the evidence. He pronounced his judgment, his voice cold and unyielding. You have betrayed your king, he said. You have betrayed your kingdom. You have betrayed my trust. For your crimes, you are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your lives. Ashford and Mallory were led away, their cries of protest echoing through the court, their fate sealed. The king turned to Warwick and Cecily, his expression softening.
You have saved my kingdom, he said.
You have saved my life. You have proven your loyalty beyond any doubt. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. And now, he said, it is time for a celebration. A wedding. A new beginning. He gave his blessing for their marriage, declaring that it should be a grand affair, a testament to their courage, their loyalty, and their love. The court, no longer a lion's den but instead once again a place of celebration, erupted in cheers. The relief was palpable, and the king felt his authority returned, stronger now. The judgment was given, but the true reward was still to come. Warwick and Cecily looked at each other, and all the tension and doubt were gone. Epilogue. The wedding of Cecily and Warwick was a spectacle of joy and renewed hope. Ravensshire, cleansed of the shadows of treachery, blossomed under their combined influence. The great hall, once a stage for deception and fear, overflowed with music, laughter, and the genuine warmth of a united people. Cecily, radiant in a gown of ivory and silver, the raven of her house embroidered with threads of gold, stood beside Warwick, his scarred face softened by a love that transcended duty and obligation. The king himself graced the ceremony, his presence a testament to their courage and a symbol of the restored stability of the realm. He bestowed upon them his blessing, not as a monarch to his subjects, but as a grateful friend to those who had saved him from ruin. Edmund, spared execution by the king's mercy and Warwick's quiet intervention, was sent to a remote monastery, a place for reflection and penance. Cecily visited him there, once, offering forgiveness and a fragile hope for reconciliation in a distant future. The wounds of betrayal ran deep, but the seeds of healing had been sown. Cecily and Warwick ruled Ravensshire with wisdom and compassion. Cecily's gift, once a source of fear and isolation, became a tool for justice and understanding. She listened to the whispers of her people, mediating disputes, uncovering injustices, and guiding her husband with her unique insight. Warwick, tempered by battle and humbled by love, proved to be a just and effective leader. He strengthened the defenses of Ravensshire, fostered trade and prosperity, and earned the respect and loyalty of his people. They had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited both their parents' strength and their mother's unique gift. The whispers of Ravensshire continued, but now they spoke of peace, of prosperity, of a future secured by love and loyalty. Years passed, and the scars of the past faded, replaced by the tapestry of a life well lived. Cecily and Warwick often walked the battlements of Ravensshire together, hand in hand, watching the sun set over the land they had saved, the land they loved, the land they had built together. One evening, as they stood on the battlements, the wind whipping at their cloaks, Cecily leaned against Warwick, her head resting on his shoulder. The silver falcon, a constant reminder of their journey, hung around her neck, its wings catching the fading light. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice a soft murmur against the wind. "Leaving the king's service? Choosing this life?" Warwick smiled, his hand gently stroking her hair. "Never," he said, his voice firm and true. "I have found my true purpose here. With you. With our family. With our people." He looked out at the landscape, at the rolling hills, the dense forests, the distant mountains. He saw not a battlefield, but a home. Not a kingdom to be conquered, but a legacy to be built. "And you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Do you ever miss the whispers of the court? The intrigue? The power?" Cecily shook her head, a smile playing on her lips. "The whispers of Ravensshire are enough for me," she said. "They speak of love, of family, of home. And that is all I have ever wanted." They stood there in silence, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had endured the trials of treachery, the test of loyalty, the weight of a crown. The wind whispered through the stones of Ravensshire, a song of hope, a song of a future secured, a song of a love that would last in eternity. It was a new song, a good song, one of their own making, and it was beautiful. The end.